Jesus said to his disciples on the road to Emmaus, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things, and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. In this well-known passage, Jesus Christ taught that the Hebrew scriptures foretold that he would have to suffer before entering into his full glory. But often when we think about this teaching of Christ, our minds go to a couple of specific passages, like Isaiah 53 and the suffering servant, or Psalm 22. But Jesus seems to have more than a couple isolated passages in mind. The text from Luke says that he went through Moses and all the prophets in his discussion. Later in Luke 24, he alludes to the three different sections of Scripture, the Torah, the Psalms, and the prophets, as all teaching collectively that he had to suffer. So where do we get this consistent teaching about the need for the Messiah to suffer in the Old Testament? Well, I believe that one important point Jesus had in mind was typology. Now, in a previous video regarding the Old Testament figure Ruth, I discussed typology and described it as a form of biblical exegesis that sees Old Testament events and people as foreshadowing or giving a foretaste of the story of Jesus Christ and the early Christian church. So in this video, we will survey several examples of Old Testament figures who give us typology of the suffering of the Messiah. You will see that a lot of Old Testament figures parallel Jesus' own sufferings as described in the Gospels. These aren't the same thing as direct prophecies, but they do speak to the continuity and internal consistency of Scripture from Old to New. This isn't just about a few isolated texts. This is about what the whole Old Testament is preparing us for. So this won't be an exhaustive video by any means, but I hope it gives you a taste of how the Scriptures prepared us for Jesus, and specifically the way he had to suffer for the sake of the people. Firstly, we will look at the example of the prophet Jeremiah, one of the major prophets in the Old Testament. In the book of Jeremiah chapter 38, the prophet prophesies that Jerusalem will be captured by the army of Babylon, which will be an indication of God's judgment. There are a number of princes who hear about these things Jeremiah is saying, and they fear that he will weaken the resolve of their soldiers. They say that his prophecies and his words will lead to the ruin of the people. And so they go and express their concerns to King Zedekiah, insisting that Jeremiah ought to be put to death. King Zedekiah says that he is in their hands. And so Jeremiah is thrown into a muddy cistern and left there to die. However, an Ethiopian court official named Ebed-Melech becomes Jeremiah's savior. He appeals to the king, who grants the court official permission to save Jeremiah. And indeed, he and some other men pull him up from the cistern. In this event, there are a number of interesting parallels to Jesus' sufferings. Firstly, like Jeremiah, Jesus is accused of putting the people and the nation in danger. That's what Caiaphas says in chapter 11 of the Gospel of John. Also interesting for both Jeremiah and Jesus, both of them, near the time that they were sentenced to death, predicted that Jerusalem would be overrun by foreigners. We also see in both instances that the top ruler over the people, King Zedekiah and Pontius Pilate, are left powerless against the will of the many. And both of them say something to the effect of, the persecutors have him in their hands. Of course, both of them were rescued from the death sentence. For Jeremiah, it was by being pulled up out of the cistern. For Jesus, it was being resurrected from the grave. Both incidents also involve a certain individual bravely going before the leader of the people and making an appeal. For Jeremiah, it was the Ethiopian court official who went before King Zedekiah to try and get Jeremiah saved. And in the case of Jesus, it was Joseph of Arimathea who boldly went before Pontius Pilate, asking for the body to be taken down from the cross so that it could be properly buried. And one more interesting parallel was Jeremiah's first words to the king after he was rescued, and Jesus' words when he was brought before the high priest, according to the Gospel of Luke. The king asked Jeremiah for advice, but Jeremiah responded with, "If I tell you anything, will you not have me put to death? If I counsel you, you will not listen to me." And then we see that Jesus offers a similar reply when the council of elders asks him if he is the Messiah. Jesus says, "If I tell you, you will not believe, and if I question, you will not respond." So in a number of interesting ways, Jesus' passion reflects the sufferings endured by Jeremiah. For our second example, let's look at Absalom. He was the son of King David, known to be a charming and handsome man who also had very long hair, which will factor in later into his story. There are a lot of things that we could say about Absalom. I encourage you to read 2 Samuel to find out more about him. But what is important to us is that at a certain point he becomes highly popular and declared himself to be king. This was while his father David was on the throne. So Absalom battled against David's forces and had some initial success. But everything came crashing down at the wood of Ephraim. Absalom's forces were badly beaten, and during his retreat, Absalom got his long hair caught in a tree, and he was left hanging from there. A witness saw this and reported it to Joab, who was the commander of David's army. Joab was frustrated that the man who told him didn't kill Absalom the moment he saw him hanging there. So Joab and his men went off to do the deed themselves, which Joab accomplished by stabbing him in the heart. In this incident, there are a lot of interesting similarities to Jesus' passion. Of course, both Absalom and Jesus were the son of David. Absalom literally so, and Jesus was referred to with this title on multiple occasions. Both of them died while hanging from a tree. Absalom, of course, because he was hanging from the tree by his hair. So the branches were wrapped around and entangled and were holding him from the tree, which sort of reflects the crown of thorns. So we could see Absalom hanging from that tree as a type of both the cross and the crown of thorns. Both of them were pierced in the heart. In Absalom's case, that is explicitly said. Jesus, we know, was pierced in the side by a Roman soldier, and based on the water and blood coming out, it likely was his heart that was pierced. And in the immediate context of the death of both Jesus and Absalom, we find that there is intense mourning. In the case of Absalom, his father David, when he found out that his son was killed, was grieving and was unable to be consoled, crying out repeatedly, "Absalom, my son." In the case of Jesus, we hear in Luke chapter 23 that after he died on the cross, the crowds returned home, beating their breasts, seemingly recognizing at least a little bit the true significance of what had just taken place. We also see the theme of people weeping when they see Jesus a couple other times in the New Testament. But one last thing that I found interesting is that in the piercing and the mourning, there is a mutual connection of the story of Absalom and the story of Christ to Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10. This text reads, "When they look on him whom they have pierced, they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and they will grieve for him as one grieves over a firstborn." So in both Jesus' passion and Absalom's death, there are themes reflected in Zechariah chapter 12, intense mourning for a beloved son who was pierced. Rather interesting. So I find this typology to be a rather powerful one. But perhaps the most powerful of all is that of Isaac, the miraculous and beloved son of Abraham and Sarah. He was the fulfillment of the promise made to Abraham that his ancestors would be as numerous as the stars of the sky and the sands on the beach. But in a shocking turn of events, Abraham was told by God to sacrifice Isaac at a place called Moriah. While this certainly would have shocked Abraham, he remained faithful to God and did not doubt. So he and Isaac went up Mount Moriah, with Isaac carrying the wood for the sacrifice. As they were doing this, Isaac questioned Abraham, asking where the lamb was that they were going to sacrifice. Abraham said in reply, "God will provide himself the lamb." Chilling words indeed from Abraham, who knew what was about to happen. Shortly after this, Isaac was bound to the altar, and Abraham lifted the knife to kill his son. But an angel stopped him right before he did it, telling him that God had been pleased by Abraham's faith. After this happened, Abraham noticed a ram stuck in a thicket, and so he sacrificed the ram in place of his son. The parallels here are really powerful. Of course, Jesus is known as the son of Abraham, just as Isaac was, both of them being a beloved son born miraculously, and they were both offered up in a sacrifice, with Isaac's being cut off before it could be completed. As far as where this took place, it's a little ambiguous, but we know it was on a mount in a place called Moriah. The only other time in the Hebrew Bible that we hear about such a place is when we hear about the construction of Solomon's temple, which was on Mount Moriah. So from very early on, it was believed that the same place where Isaac was nearly sacrificed is where the temple was built. So it is quite possible that Jesus' crucifixion and Isaac's binding took place within a few hundred meters of each other. Of course, we hear that Isaac carried the wood up the mount for the sacrifice, reflecting Jesus carrying the wood for his sacrifice in carrying the cross. But this also tells us something else. If Isaac was strong enough to carry the wood, that likely means he was stronger than his father. We often have this picture of Isaac being a little boy when this is taking place, and it's really a horrifying, frightening image. But it seems from the text that Isaac was a young man at this time, capable of carrying the wood up the mount. What this also likely means is that if he wanted to overpower or run away from his father, he probably could have. And so the Jewish tradition is pretty unanimous here, that Isaac was not forced into this against his will. He was a willing participant. This was a potential death that he freely accepted. Once again, a very powerful parallel to Jesus, who laid down his own life freely. We also get this interesting statement by Abraham about God providing the lamb. Yet it doesn't seem to be fully fulfilled. They sacrifice a ram, not a lamb. So it almost seems like the lamb that God will provide still needed to be sacrificed. There's so much more that I could say about this one, but I'll just leave it off with one last thing. We see in Hebrews a summary of this story of Isaac's binding. And Hebrews says that Abraham reasoned that God was able to raise even from the dead, and he received Isaac back as a symbol. So the author of Hebrews sees Isaac's binding as a sort of symbol or type or preparation of the resurrection of Jesus. Because Abraham, knowing that God told him he would have many descendants through Isaac, he must have concluded that God would even be able to raise Isaac from the dead, if that's what it took for God to fulfill his promise. Next up, we'll look at Daniel, another one of the major prophets. In the book of Daniel, we hear that he served King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, and then King Darius takes over. Daniel being a prophet who can interpret dreams, was superior to all of Darius's ministers. And so the ministers, frustrated by Daniel, tried to find grounds to accuse him, but they were unable, because Daniel was a just man. So they decided to convince King Darius to make a new law that says that anyone who prays to anyone but the king would be killed. And Darius agrees. Daniel, even though he knows about this new law, continues to pray to the Lord. Because of this, the ministers exposed Daniel and told Darius that he needed to be put to death. Darius was greatly upset by this and tried all he could to save Daniel, but he was unable to, because the law could not be changed. So Daniel was thrown into the lion's den. But God protected him and shut the mouths of the lions. After this, Daniel's position was restored, the ministers who plotted against him were thrown to the lions, and the king officially feared the God of Israel. Once again, there's a lot of really interesting parallels here. Just like with Daniel, Jesus' accusers were jealous of him and tried to find a way to get rid of him, but they struggled to. As we hear, they tried to get witnesses to testify against him, but they were having trouble doing it, until two came forward to make up an accusation against him. In both the case of Daniel and Jesus, the ruler over them, Darius and Pilate respectively, tried to save him, but were pressured into allowing the death sentence because of the insistence of the people. Both the Passion and Daniel's time of suffering involved a stone being rolled over the place where he was. A stone was rolled over the lion's den, and as we know, the stone was rolled over Jesus' tomb. In both Jesus' and Daniel's case, they were found to be alive early in the morning. It was King Darius who went to the lion's den early in the morning to check and see if Daniel was alive. And in the case of Jesus, of course, it was the women. Another interesting type of Jesus' suffering is Jonah, one of the minor prophets, who was called by God to be a prophet to the people of Nineveh. Jonah tried to escape the call of God via a ship, but God did not permit that to take place. A great storm arose, and it was determined that Jonah was the reason for it. He told the men that he should be thrown overboard for the storm to stop, and eventually the men obliged, which stopped the storm. Jonah, meanwhile, was swallowed by a great fish or whale. After 3 days, he was released onto the land, and he went on to be that prophet for Nineveh. In both the case of Jesus and Jonah, there were men who sincerely desired to save him from death. In Jonah's case, a number of men on the ship tried to keep going, even when the storm was raging, because they didn't want to have to throw Jonah overboard, but eventually they had to. Similar to Pontius Pilate, who tried to release Jesus, but realized that there was no way he was going to be able to do that without causing a riot. Now the men with Jonah, after realizing there was no other way, plead to God and say, "Do not charge us with shedding innocent blood." Similar language to what we hear from Pilate, who says he is innocent of Jesus' blood, or Judas, saying that he has sinned in betraying innocent blood, or the multiple times that Pilate insisted to the crowd that Jesus was innocent. Interestingly, in Jonah's case, he wasn't really innocent, because he had tried to escape from God's call. But in any case, we see this idea of innocence for the one who is about to have to suffer. Of course, the most interesting parallel of all, one that Jesus himself comments on in Matthew chapter 12, is that Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights, just as the Son of Man would be buried in the heart of the earth 3 days and 3 nights. Now, if you're confused by that expression, 3 days and 3 nights, even though we know Jesus wasn't in the tomb for a literal 3 days and 3 nights, check out this video by Inspiring Philosophy that I will link in the description. Long story short, there is absolutely no contradiction. But we see that Jesus himself saw a connection between Jonah's time of suffering and what he was going to have to go through. And finally, something that's often missed in the story of Jonah, after he was swallowed by this whale or great fish, but before he was released, we hear that Jonah was praying to God. In chapter 2, we hear some of his prayers, and they paint a rather interesting picture. In Jonah's prayer, he says to God, "Out of the belly of Sheol I cried." Sheol, or Hades, was the place of the dead. Jonah also says in his prayer, "You brought my life up from the pit." This sort of language is very powerful and might even suggest that Jonah had died while he was in the great fish. So yet another parallel for Jesus and Jonah, that even if Jonah didn't literally die, his experience being in the belly of the great fish was something he saw as a sort of death, and that being spit up and getting a second chance at prophecy was a type of resurrection. Another important figure we have to look at is Samson, one of the judges of Israel. In fact, the last one mentioned in the book of Judges. Samson was given immense strength as part of a Nazirite vow to God. And part of this vow was that you were not supposed to cut your hair. And Samson didn't, and as a result, he had this strength to kill a lion with his bare hands, killing 1,000 Philistines with a jawbone. But his strength was sapped when his lover Delilah betrayed him, cutting his hair, which allowed him to be caught and tortured and humiliated by the Philistines. But as this went on, Samson's hair started growing back, and eventually he had strength again. So he avenged himself by destroying the Philistines' temple and killing many of them. So in this we see a number of interesting parallels. Both of them involved a betrayal taking place by someone very close to him. In Samson's case, Delilah. In Jesus' case, Judas. Both Jesus and Samson were blinded as part of their tortures. In Samson's case, his eyes were plucked out. In Jesus' case, he was blindfolded and then beaten. In both cases, he was emptied or weakened during his arrest and his time of suffering. In Jesus' case, that was the kenosis, the emptying of himself, though he was in the form of God. Both Jesus and Samson died with a shout and with stretched out arms. And for both of them, their death was really a curse more so for their enemies. In Samson's case, as we hear, he killed more Philistines at the moment of his death than he did in his entire lifetime. And in Jesus' case, Jesus' death on the cross was the absolute worst thing that could have happened for the kingdom of death and the kingdom of Satan. And the final example we will look at is Moses. He needs no introduction. The Hebrew prophet who led Israel out of Egypt. But after the Exodus, the Amalekites attacked Israel, unprovoked, and there was later a battle between the Israelites and the Amalekites. Moses watched this from a hill, and they found that Israel was winning when Moses lifted his hands, raising the staff above his head. But when Moses lowered his hands, Israel started losing. And so Moses had his hands raised all the way until that evening. But he tired from doing this, obviously. So Moses' relatives, Hur and Aaron, helped hold his hands up so that Israel would win. And they indeed defeated the Amalekites. So in both of these cases, the suffering involves going to the top of a hill, with arms raised and stretched out for the sake of God's chosen people. Both Jesus and Moses had their arms raised until sunset. That was when Jesus was taken down from the cross and buried by Joseph of Arimathea. In both cases, we have the image of Moses and Jesus respectively raising their arms with one person on either side of them. It was the two thieves crucified with Jesus, and then Aaron and Hur for Moses. And we also learn something interesting, that both Moses and Jesus, as great as both of them were supported by others. In the midst of their suffering, for the sake of the people. In Moses' case, it was Aaron and Hur helping him keep his arms raised. And in Jesus' case, weakened extensively by the beatings and the lashes, it was Simon of Cyrene who helped him carry the cross to Golgotha. So I think that gives a pretty profound message, that our sufferings are not meant to be taken on alone. If these two men could be helped through their suffering for the sake of the people of God, then we should follow that example, letting others help us through our own sufferings and being support for others in their sufferings. So that concludes the examples that I can cover here. There are a number of others that I could have talked about. Joseph, the son of Jacob, Elijah, Noah, as well as the king of Ai. But this should help you see how many different Old Testament figures had to suffer for the sake of God's plan, and how their sufferings reflected Jesus' sufferings in a number of interesting ways. Arms raised and stretched out, betrayal that involves pieces of silver, a beloved son hanging from a tree, carrying wood to the place of sacrifice, hesitance on the part of the rulers of the people, and redemption or vindication in the face of death. And this is all just scratching the surface. But what I think this can teach us is that if Moses and Samson and Jonah and Jeremiah and Daniel and all these other significant figures had to suffer for the sake of God's plan, why should we expect any different when the Messiah comes to the earth to bring God's kingdom to us? This is especially exemplified in Jesus' parable about the wicked tenants. When servants came, who symbolized the prophets, to reap what belonged to their master, some were killed, others were beaten, others were stoned to death. And finally, the landowner sent his son, thinking he would be respected. But they treated him the exact same way. So the Old Testament prepared the way, and Jesus fulfilled it, showing us that anyone who wishes to follow God will indeed have to suffer before entering into their glory.